Do you want to use custom domain names for your workloads on Azure rather than using the default FQDNs or the domain names, host names provided by Azure? Private DNS Zones provides the name resolution for the workloads within and between the virtual networks and allows to tailor the virtual networks that fits your organizational needs. Hi, my name is Neeraj Kumar and this is part 2 of understanding and implementing Azure DNS, and in this module we are going to discuss on how to configure private DNS zone for custom domain names. Stay tuned. As I had mentioned, private DNS zone can be used when you wish to use a custom domain name for your Azure resources rather than using the Azure provided host names. This helps in syncing up with your organizational needs. One important point to note is that this domain name may or may not be a domain that is registered with a domain registrar. And in case it is registered with a domain registrar and you wish to create a public DNS zone as well, then you can configure both public and private DNS zone with the same name, and it is called a split horizon view. In this case, the domain would be available over the public internet. And in the previous one, the domain would only be allowed to be accessed from within the virtual network. Let's try to understand this with a use case. A simple scenario would be that a user wishes to connect to VM2 with a URL from within VM1. He requests for a URL which is a custom FQDN. This request goes to the private DNS zone to look for the URL. As the request is coming in locally from a VM within the virtual network, the private DNS zone tries to resolve the URL by looking for the URL locally in its cache or the database of hostname and IP addresses. And if it is able to find the match for the requested URL, it returns the mapped private IP address of the target workload corresponding to the URL. Now that the source has the private IP address, the request flows to the destination VM. This is a very basic request flow. One interesting fact is that the DNS records for the private DNS zone are not viewable or retrievable, but the DNS records are registered and will be resolved as expected. In case you are unaware or need more information about the public DNS zone, you can watch my previous video where I have discussed explicitly on the public DNS zones. The link to the video appears on the top right hand side corner. It's prudent for you to understand the benefits that you get while using the private DNS zone. There are 7 main benefits. Let's discuss them one at a time. The first one is that it removes the need for custom DNS solutions. Many organizations had to use the custom DNS solutions in their virtual network for the DNS zone management. With private DNS zone, you can now perform DNS zone management by using the native Azure infrastructure. The second is that you can use all common DNS record types. Azure DNS supports AAAA, CNAME, MX type, PTR, SOA, SRV, and TXT records. So it is just like the public DNS zone that we had discussed in our previous session. The third one is automatic hostname record management. Azure automatically maintains hostname records for the VMs in the virtual network once registered in the DNS zone. In this scenario, you can optimize the domain names without worrying about the IP address it has been mapped to. That will be taken care by the DNS zone itself. Then we have the host name resolution between virtual network. Private DNS zones can be shared between virtual networks. In this case, the host name resolution between the VNets will be taken care by the private DNS zone. This capability simplifies the cross-network and service discovery scenarios such as virtual network peering. And this is more common where the network design is kind of a hub and spoke, where you have one hub connecting to multiple spokes of different virtual networks. The next one is the familiar tools and user experience. We can use the well-established tools like PowerShell, Azure Resource Manager templates, and the REST API for creating and managing the private DNS zone. It's very similar to the public DNS zone, right? One of the very important thing is that it also allows the split horizon DNS support. With Azure DNS, you can create zones with the same name that resolves to different answers from within a virtual network and from a public internet. So a typical scenario could be like, I can do a www.azuretraining.com from the public internet, and also I can do a www.azuretraining.com from inside the VM without the internet, from inside the virtual network, and both will work because both the public DNS zone and the private DNS zones are configured. Last but not the least, we have the private DNS zones available in all the regions. The Azure DNS private zones feature is available in all the regions in the Azure public cloud. Let us now discuss about the scenarios where we can put private DNS zones into practice. The first scenario could be the name resolution scoped to a virtual network, a single virtual network. In this scenario, supposedly you have a virtual network in Azure that has many resources in it, and that includes the virtual machines as well. The requirement is that you need to resolve the resources in the virtual network using a specific domain name. And you also need the naming resolution to be private. That is, it is not accessible from the public internet. Lastly, you need Azure to automatically register VMs into the DNS zone. The second scenario is about the name resolution across virtual networks. In this scenario, you need to associate a private zone with multiple virtual networks. You can implement this solution in various network architectures like hub and spoke model. This configuration is when a central hub virtual network is used to connect to multiple spoke virtual networks together. The central hub virtual network can be linked as a registration virtual network, and the spoke virtual networks can be linked as a resolution virtual networks. Let us try to understand this scenario using an example. So we have a private DNS zone, and then we have a virtual network 1 and a virtual network 2. In the virtual network 1, I have two virtual machines. One is VM1 with an IP address of 10.0.0.1, and the second one is VM2 where we have the private IP address of 10.0.0.2. Both of them have their own host names. In the second virtual network also, we have two different VMs, VM1 and VM2, with two different IP address and host names. The IP addresses are 10.0.1.1 and 10.0.1.2. Now suppose there is a query from VM1 about vnet1-vm1.azuretraining.com. On the left hand side, we see that VM1 from vnet1 has the host name of vnet1-vm1.azuretraining.com. So the private DNS zone resolves it and responds with a private IP address of 10.0.0.1. Now, if there is a query for a PTR, that is the reverse DNS for 10.0.0.2, which is the private IP address of VM2 in virtual network 1, it will return a response of NX domain that this host name could not be found. So if there is a reverse DNS request from a virtual machine within one virtual network for a virtual machine in another virtual network, it will return an NX domain that the host name is not found. Whereas if there is a reverse DNS query about 10.0.0.1, and since it is within the same virtual network, private DNS zone is able to resolve that and returns the response with vnet1-vm1.azuretraining.com. That is the host name of VM1, and it is because both the VMs are in the same virtual network. So the reverse DNS works only within the same virtual network. The reverse DNS does not work for different virtual networks, whereas the direct query for the host name resolves to the proper IP addresses. We also have a third scenario, and in this scenario, you may have a private and a public version of your application that has different functionality or behavior, and you require the use of the same domain name for both the versions, so you can access it from the public internet or from within the virtual network without the internet. So this scenario can be accomplished by creating a public and the private zone that we had discussed earlier. And this is called split horizon view. So here I am on my Azure portal for the demo of private DNS zone. And as you can see on the dashboard, I have few resources that I have already created. One is the resource group, which is obvious, I need to create it. And then we have etcsl VNet. This is the virtual network. And within this virtual network, I have two virtual machines, VM1 and VM2. Both the virtual machines were created inside the virtual networks. We'll go one by one on each of the virtual machines and look at the configuration. If we scroll down, we will see that this has been given a private IP address of 10.0.0.4 and a public IP address of 2204 and so on and so forth. So we are not bothered about it. We'll go back and click on VM2 as well. And now here also I can see that it has been given a private IP address of 10.0.0.5 with a public IP address. So we are good with this. Now the second step is to create the private DNS zone. So for that, I'll click on the search bar and type in private DNS zone and click on the first link that appears. So once I'm there, I have two ways to create the private DNS zone. I can either click on the create button on the top left hand corner, or I can do it via the create private DNS zone button at the bottom of the page. I'll click on it. And here it's a simple page where I can create the private DNS zone. For the resource group, I can choose ATCSL, the resource group that I had already created. And for the name, I'll give it a name of kurari.com because that is the name that I want to register. And here something to point out is that why am I using kurari.com is because I do not want to use a public DNS zone, and this can be any domain name. So I have put a name as kurari.com. There is nothing else to change. Since the resource group was created in Central India, this resource group location shows as Central India and it's grayed out. I can click on review and create, and once validated, I can click on create again. This will not take much time, but I'll still pause the video and return back once this is deployed successfully. So it has been deployed successfully. I can click on go to resource. And here you can see that the private DNS zone has been successfully created, and by default, it has an SOA record type already created. So it's just like the public DNS zone where the SOA records are created, but the difference is that there we have the name server records also created, being a public DNS zone, but here the name server records are not created. I can add the record set by clicking on the plus record set button, and I can create the record sets. But this is not needed as of now, so I'll click on close and I'll scroll down and I'll go to virtual network links under settings. And why this is needed? Because I want to register the virtual network with this private DNS zone so that the virtual machines can be accessed via the host name. So once we are there, I'll give it a link name, VNet link ATCSL. For the subscription, I have Azure Trading because that's the only subscription I have. For the virtual network, I had already created ATCSL VNet as the virtual network. So that is what I'm going to choose from the drop down. And finally, I have the configuration where it says enable auto registration. So what does it mean? That if the enable auto registration box is checked and enabled, it means that whenever a new virtual machine is created, it will automatically be registered with this private DNS zone. So I'll click on it and then finally click on OK. So the process for registering the virtual network under virtual network links for the private DNS zone has already started. Again, it will take a couple of minutes, so we will wait for it to be completed before proceeding further. Here you go. The virtual network has been registered under the virtual network links of the private DNS zone. Now if we click on overview and scroll down, we will see that there are two A records created for VM1 as well as VM2 with a private IP address of 10.0.0.4 and 10.0.0.5. So both the record sets for VM1 and VM2 has been created, and if I click on VM1, I will see the host name as vm1.kurari.com. So I can access this VM using the host name as well. And this is the custom host name that we created using the private DNS zone. So if I click back on Kurari.com and look for VM2, here we have a different host name for VM2, which is vm2.kurari.com. That's the host name that has been assigned to VM2 here. Now that this is done, I want to confirm one additional point. We are going to create one additional virtual machine and see whether the auto registration works or not. So we will click on create a virtual machine, and once we are on that page, we will choose the resource group as ATCSL, scroll down, give this virtual machine the name of VM3, and then enter the user ID and password that is needed by the administrator. So ATCSL admin is the username, and then I will type in the password. I'll reconfirm the password again. I'll scroll down to check there's nothing else to do. We'll click on review and create, and once it has passed the validation, I'll click on create again. Since this is a very basic deployment, it will not take much time and the deployment will be completing soon, but I'll still pause the video and return back after the deployment is complete. I can click on go to resources. Now the deployment is completed. Scroll down and see that the private IP address of 10.0.0.6 has been assigned to this particular virtual machine, which is VM3. Now the moment of truth. I can go back to the private DNS zone and see whether the record was created for this virtual machine as well. So I'll click on Kurari.com, and once I'm there, I'll scroll down to see whether the record was created. And here you go. We have the A record for VM3 was successfully created and mapped to the IP address 10.0.0.6. And if we click on this, it shows the host name as vm3.kurari.com. So that concludes the demo, and I hope you were able to understand what the private DNS zone is, how it works, and the benefit it brings along. I hope you liked the video, and if you did, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel to motivate me to bring such informative videos on Azure administration as well as Azure Architect. And these videos are also helpful for your Azure administration certification as well. Thank you so much for joining with me on this course. And until we meet next time, keep azuring.